In your statement, I think that the most troubling thing is the following quote from you. Even the most pessimistic assessment did not predict the government forces in Kabul would collapse while U.S. forces remained. I back that up by saying you also cite General Milley, who said there was no indication that there would be a rapid collapse of the Afghan army and government. For much of last year, I was the acting chairman of intelligence. I'm now the vice chairman of intelligence. I've been tracking this very, very closely. And just going back to the beginning of this year, obviously I can't quote the titles of the pieces, but let me suffice it to say that there are numerous pieces that would be categorized as it's going to hit the fan. And but let's just for a moment put that aside, okay? Because I think any analysis of those pieces would have led anyone to that conclusion. Putting that aside for a moment, we had every reason to believe and to plan for the rapid collapse of the Afghan military and the Afghan government. At the beginning of 2020, by all admissions, we had a already really bad status quo in Afghanistan. Okay, we had a small footprint, but we had a strong commitment to air support, and that sustained the Afghan security forces' ability to resist the Taliban. The security forces of Afghanistan were suffering 10,000 casualties a year. The Taliban was suffering casualties too, but they enjoyed safe haven in Pakistan. They were able to go there to rest, to refit, to train, to recruit. And so in summary, even before the withdrawal, we had a terrible status quo. The security forces, a small number of U.S. forces, continued to die. We had U.S. losses as well. I want to mention that. But the Afghan government was still fractious and corrupt. And the Taliban had an unchallenged safe haven in Pakistan. Or put another way, and paraphrasing your own words from your opening statement, if after 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in support, equipment, and training, there's not enough for the Afghan government or the Afghan security forces to become more resilient or self-sustaining, what did we think was going to happen as that support began to be removed? What did we think was going to happen when that terrible status quo was changed? It doesn't take some exquisite piece of intelligence or some brilliant analysis to conclude that if you radically change an already bad status quo, by removing U.S. and NATO forces, by ending enablers and air support, the status quo was going to collapse in favor of the Taliban. This is not an argument in favor of staying. I think that ship has sailed, okay? And I know a lot of time has been spent on justifying the withdrawal. We're not debating the withdrawal. What I'm arguing is we had a terrible status quo as is, by your own admission. The Afghan government, even after billions of dollars in 20 years, was not self-sustaining, was not resilient. We should have known that as we began to draw down support, we were going to see the potential for a collapse. And that's what all these pieces pointed to as well. So it's concerning that no one saw all of this and concluded that there was no evidence or no reason to believe that there could be a rapid collapse. More to that point, we began to see clear signs weeks ago that this is where it was headed. Without airstrikes, the Taliban now began to mass and maneuver, going from intimidating these small Afghan outposts to actually getting them into quitting. We were seeing Afghan outposts begin to quit. The Taliban they went from surrounding these small provincial capitals to surrounding major cities with 5,000 to 8,000 Taliban fighters. This is weeks before. By the way, this is at the same time as I believe on July 8th, President Biden was still giving this naive, optimistic prediction about the fighting capabilities of the Afghan forces and so forth. We could see them meticulously focused on the north. You could see that they were methodically and carefully splintering the sclerotic remains of any sort of resistance. Weeks before the fall of Kabul, you could see the Taliban was on the verge, was headed towards doing something they hadn't done before. They were going to isolate Kabul from the north, cutting off all their supply routes. So we knew weeks before that we were headed for a Taliban control of the north. All the traditional routes of Taliban encroachment on Kabul were nearly sealed, the south and the east. Kabul faced the prospect of no fuel. The Afghan government faced the prospect of being unable to mount any viable opposition and sustain defense. What did we think was going to happen? All of those things were in place at the time. And I think the most concerning part of it is that if we didn't have an analysis that looked at all this, this wasn't a failure of intelligence. This was a failure of policy and planning. We have the wrong people analyzing this. Someone didn't see this. Either someone didn't see this or someone didn't want to see this because we had established this, we wanted to be out by September 11th so that we could have some ceremony arguing that we got and pulled out of Afghanistan on the anniversary of 9/11. The fact of the matter is, where it leaves us now, on top of all the other things that have been mentioned here from a geopolitical perspective, is not a good place. I think China and Russia and Iran, they look at this botched withdrawal, and what they see is incompetence that they think they might be able to exploit, may lead to miscalculation. I think the Europeans, our allies, who had very little say, if any, or control certainly over the timing and the execution of all this, they're now, number one, have to be wondering about our reliability, the credibility of our defense agreements with them, but they also have to be really, really upset at the prospects of a massive refugee crisis landing right on their borders here very soon. And India, and I know that there was an announcement today, there'll be a meeting of the Quad fairly soon, which is a good development, except that in the Pacific region, if you're India, you're looking at this and saying, if the United States allowed Pakistan to unravel their standing, because the Pakistani role in all this, and I think multiple administrations are guilty of ignoring it, the Pakistani role in enabling the Taliban is ultimately a victory for those pro-Taliban hardliners in the Pakistani government. They have to be looking at this and saying, if the United States could have a third-rate power like Pakistan unravel its aims, what chance do they have of confronting China? So I think this leaves us in a terrible situation, but I go back to the initial point. I don't know how it's possible. If in fact, the people in charge of our foreign policy did not see all of these factors and conclude that there was a very real possibility of a very rapid collapse, then we've got the wrong people making military and diplomacy decisions in our government.
Senator, I'm happy to respond briefly in the time that we have. As you know from your own expertise and leadership on these matters, there are constant assessments being done, and in this particular case, assessments being done of the resilience of Afghan security forces, of the Afghan government, and different scenarios established, from worst case to best case to everything in between. And ultimately, the preponderance of the intelligence and assessments land someplace, and there are always going to be voices, and critically important that we listen to all of them, who may be talking about exclusively the worst case, some best case, some in between. Here's what I can say in this setting, and we can take this up as well in other settings. Back in February, the assessment of the overall assessment of the community was that after a complete U.S. military withdrawal, that could potentially, in the worst case scenario, lead to the Taliban capturing Kabul within a year or two. So that's back in February, and that was more or less where things stood in the winter and into the spring. By July, and you're exactly right, that the situation was deteriorating as the Taliban continued to make progress on the ground throughout the summer. In July, the IC indicated that it was more likely than not that the Taliban would take over by the end of the year, the end of this year. That said, we, the intelligence community, did not say that the countrywide collapse of all meaningful resistance would be likely to occur in a matter of days. And you referenced Chairman Milley, as I did earlier. Nothing that he saw, that I saw, that we saw suggested that this government and security force would collapse in a matter of 11 days. And you're right that I think we need to look back at all of this because, to your point, we collectively, over 20 years, invested extraordinary amounts in those security forces and in that government. Hundreds of billions of dollars, equipment, training, advice, support. And based on that, as well as based on what we were looking at real time, again, we did not see this collapse in a matter of 11 days. But I think it is important that we go back and look at all of this.
The time has expired.
Thank you.
Senator Shaheen.